The Gallipoli campaign would be one of the biggest disasters for the Allies during World War I. Brave young men were sent into a meat grinder. There were between 140 and 230,000 casualties on the Allies side and over 250,000 casualties on the Ottoman Empire side in under 1 year of fighting. The Western Front was in a stalemate in 1915. The fast-moving war of 1914 was over, and both sides were dug in for a long, hard-fought battle for survival in the mud-filled trenches. The Ottoman Empire was originally neutral in the first few months of the war. The Allies sailed through the Dardanelles into the Black Sea. This was their supply line to Russia, since they could not travel overland anymore. The Ottoman Empire attacked Odessa on October 29th, attacking Russian ships and officially joining the war October 31st, allying themselves with the Central Powers. Russia declared war shortly after, followed by France and Great Britain. The First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, came up with the plan to take the Dardanelles for the Allies and get the Ottoman Empire out of the war in a swift attack. They planned to go all the way to Constantinople. They planned to use old warships that could not go up against Germany. High Command was also reluctant to give men to the operation. Their eyes were focused on the Western Front, even though it was deadlocked. Turkish soldiers were considered inferior to European soldiers at the time. No one believed they would put up much of a fight. The Allies planned to send minesweepers into the Dardanelles Straits to clear a path for a land invasion, along with the old warships to pound the Ottoman forts with artillery ahead of the invasion. The initial part of the plan did not go well. The Allies had little success in destroying the mines and lost ships in the process. Lord Kitchener appointed Sir Ian Hamilton to lead the 78,000-man force into battle. The Anzacs were formed in Egypt in preparation for the attack, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the British 29th Royal Navy Division. The French formed the Orient Expeditionary Force. They all met in Egypt to prepare. On March 18, 1915, 18 battleships attacked the Dardanelles Straits. The minesweepers missed a large amount of mines. The French ship Bouvet hit a mine and sunk, killing almost all of its crew. The HMS Irresistible sunk after hitting a mine. The HMS Inflexible was damaged by a mine. The HMS Ocean was sent to rescue the Irresistible, but was hit by a mine and sunk. The French ships Suffren and Galloway were damaged by a mine and withdrew. The attack was a disaster. The Turkish batteries fired most of their shells at the Allies, and most of their communications were down. They also lost some of their guns. The Allies pulled out even though some believed they were close to victory. After this attack, they believed they could not win by naval power alone, and a land invasion was necessary. After the March 18th attack, the Ottoman Empire prepared for an invasion. The Allies planned to land at a number of beaches. At the tip of the peninsula, around Cape Helles, the British; north of Gallipoli, the Anzacs. A diversionary landing was at Belair by the Royal Navy, and the French at Kumkale across the straits as a diversionary landing. On April 25, 1915, the invasion commenced, the largest land invasion of its time. In the early morning, the plan was the 3rd Brigade would land on open beaches north of Gallipoli, go across land to Maltepe, but they drifted to an area with steep cliffs over a mile to the north. This would be known as Anzac Cove. There were not very many Turkish soldiers protecting this beach due to the high cliffs and deep ravines. The Anzacs pushed forward, but due to the terrain got separated and even got lost trying to reach their objectives. The small Turkish force wreaked havoc on the Anzacs, but were pushed back and retreated. The Australia and New Zealand 1st and 2nd Brigades were supposed to be reserves. They landed at Arbrunno and mixed with the 1st Landing Force. Mustafa Kemal had sent reinforcements to this area after hearing of the landing, setting up on high ground at Chinook Bear. He counterattacked throughout the day, inflicting large casualties. Any grounds the Anzacs had gained was lost. They were pushed back by the Turkish machine guns and snipers. The Anzacs were ordered to dig in where they were and wait for the other Allied attacks. The landings at Cape Helles were at 5 beaches, S, V, W, X, and Y. The Lancashires at W Beach lost over half their men, but defeated the Turkish defenders. This beach is known as Lancashire Landing. At V Beach, the River Clyde ran aground with 2,000 troops on board. As the doors opened and troops exited the ship, the Turkish machine guns peppered the soldiers. Of the first 200 to leave the ship, only 21 made it to the beach. The first lifeboat, filled with 40 soldiers, made it to the beach with just 3 alive. Hundreds were killed or wounded before making it to the beach. The soldiers were pinned down on the beach by machine gun fire till nightfall. At Y Beach, 2,000 soldiers landed and encountered little resistance. They were seen sitting on the cliffs without further orders. The commander withdrew the troops to the beach. S Beach was a success. The Navy covered the invaders with artillery fire. They saw little casualties. X Beach was guarded by just 12 Turkish soldiers. The landing was successful and the troops reached the cliffs rather quickly. The hospital ships were filled the first day. The beaches were littered with dead and wounded. At the heights of Chinook Bear, the Turks ran out of ammunition. Mustafa Kemal ordered the men not to fight, but to die. One of Mustafa's battalions was completely destroyed. On the first day, hundreds of dead littered the waters, the beaches, the cliffs, ravines, and the highlands. Some of the men were left where they died until the campaign was over. Ellis Silas described his account on reaching the beach that day in his diary. It was a relief to get ashore. We were packed so tightly in the boats and moreover so heavily laden with our kits that had a shot hit the boat, we would have no chance of saving ourselves. It was awful, the feeling of utter helplessness. Meanwhile, the Turks were pelting us hot and fast. In jumping ashore, I fell over. My kit was so heavy that I couldn't get up without help. Fortunately, the waters were shallow at this point. Otherwise, well, I'm here to relate the incident. It was a magnificent spectacle to see those thousands of men rushing through this hail of death, as though it were some big game. The Allies' plan had failed. Very little of the objectives were reached, and most of the men were now dug in across the beaches, ravines, and steep cliffs close to the water. Around 100,000 soldiers had landed after a week, and Turkish reinforcements poured in. Attacks and counterattacks killed and wounded many men in the early days of the landing. Snipers and artillery were a huge problem for the Allied troops. They were forced to dig trenches and tunnels in the surrounding cliffs. Lack of water and sleep was a big problem on both sides. Troops stayed on the line for days at a time and moved supplies and digged when they weren't fighting. Elias described one of the few watering holes he had to drink from in his diary. This was always covered by the Turkish snipers. In fact, it was safer in the trenches than at this place. It was quite one of the warmest spots at Anzac. The poor fellow in the dugout was caught just a few minutes before I filled my water bottle. All around here were wounded and men who had been hit while dodging round this corner. However, one must drink, even if the price be death. The men's rations were meager. They ate bully beef, rice, jam, some bread when it was available, and hardtack. The men often suffered trying to eat the hardtack since it was extremely hard. Soldiers were known to break teeth in the process of eating. The Turks ate more bread, and they had honey, rice, and some meats, fruit, and vegetables. The Turks and Allies even traded with one another. Some parts of no man's land were just a few meters wide. When the Australian Light Horse arrived as reinforcements, their 6,000 horses were almost all sent back, after not being able to unload them and having no water for them. The Light Horse would be foot soldiers at Gallipoli instead. They would suffer huge losses at the Battle of Neck. The Light Horse waited in trenches as the Navy pounded the Turkish front lines with an artillery barrage. The artillery was supposed to stop at a certain time, then the light horse would attack, but the naval bombardment ended 7 minutes early, and the officers did not change their plans to attack sooner. They waited the extra 7 minutes to attack. This gave the Turks enough time to prepare. The first wave was completely cut down by machine gun fire. The second wave was also completely cut down. After witnessing the devastating losses in the first and second wave, the officers asked for the assault to be canceled, but the officer in charge denied this. A third wave was sent over the top and was gunned down by the Turkish machine guns. Part of the fourth wave went over the top before the assault could be halted. They also got gunned down in the process. Out of the 600 light horse, 234 were killed and 138 were wounded. The 1981 movie Gallipoli, starring Mel Gibson and Mark Lee, shows this battle and its loss of life that followed at the Battle of Neck. Constant artillery and fire, plus the itching from lice, kept the men awake. Hygiene was a big problem for the men. When they could, they bathed in the sea and washed their clothes in the salt water. Artillery shells had to be dodged while swimming and bathing in the sea. On one occasion, 8 men were wounded while swimming. One came out of the water while holding his own arm. Elias described swimming in his diary. This was certainly a most unique experience. I remember how delightful it was to be immersed in the sea after not having a decent wash for about 3 weeks. We would hear the enemy's gunfire, then shell! Out we would all scamper like a crowd of naughty schoolboys and take cover behind anything on the beach that afforded shelter. Then, after the shell had burst, back we would go into the sea. I remember the beautiful color of the water and the ships lying out on the horizon. Shell! This time we were nearly caught, for 2 or 3 shells came sliding through the air and burst quite close to us. However, we were determined not to be done out of our swim, so back in the water we went. Elias. The conditions were horrible, and the summer heat in the Dardanelles would take its toll on both sides. The summer of 1915 would be one of the hottest summers on record. Dysentery started to plague the men. The unsanitary conditions brought in flies. The Anzacs were in such a tight area that they had to dig latrines close to the trenches. On some occasions, they were even built in the trenches. The flies got on the men's food after landing in the latrines. This made the men horribly sick. The flies, lice, and lack of water were constantly on the men's minds. All of the water had to be hauled to the front line. Water was brought on ships and then stored in tanks, then rationed to the men. The dysentery was crippling. Tens of thousands were sent to the hospital ships due to extreme dysentery. More men were sent away on hospital ships sick than wounded. The battle at Sula Bay was another blunder in the Gallipoli campaign during the August offensive. The battle was supposed to be a surprise landing to gain ground and eventually take the peninsula. The Turks received word that an attack was imminent. Once the British and Australian troops landed, they took some of the hills around the beaches, but they did not keep pushing inland. The Turks had a limited number in the area, just over 1,000 men, so they were outnumbered 10 to 1. The Turks were able to regroup and take the high ground. They again fired down on the Allied positions, having the superior position. The British commander, Frederick Stopford, was relieved of his command after this. The Allies suffered over 20,000 casualties. The Turks suffered 9,000. The Anzacs had better luck at the Battle of Lone Pine. A naval bombardment softened up the Turkish front line. The Australians went over the top and fought to the Turkish front line. They found the trench had a wooden roof, and they fought their way through, firing through the logs into the trench and then breaking it apart. The Australians took the front line and went even further and fought back counterattacks by the Turks. The Turks suffered 6,000 casualties. The Australians suffered 2,200. Ellis Silas suffered shell shock due to constant shelling and gunfire. He was sent to the hospital ship on May 17th and was hospitalized in Australia. Many men suffered shell shock in the Gallipoli campaign as well as the entire Great War. It was a new illness and doctors did not know how to properly treat it. Many officers and doctors believed that the men were just acting or were being cowards. We know it now as PTSD. Later in the war, it became clear that shell shock was a real illness, and the hospitals filled up. When winter came, a new hell plagued the men. The 1915 winter in the Dardanelles would be one of the coldest winters for decades. When the Allies arrived in late April, they were not dressed for winter, and with shortages on supplies, it was hard to get cold weather gear. Cold rains ran down the hills and off the cliffs into the trenches. The men were miserable on both sides. 16,000 were evacuated due to frostbite. Ian Hamilton was replaced by Charles Monroe as Commander-in-Chief in October. He went to review the troops and inspected the beaches. He was appalled by what he saw. After 3 days, he sent a telegram to Secretary of War Kitchener. He recommended an evacuation, but wanted Kitchener to see for himself and make the final decision. Kitchener arrived and walked the Allied lines and met with the troops. Kitchener agreed the troops would be removed from Gallipoli. Shortly after, Winston Churchill resigned as First Lord of the Admiralty. He joined the Western Front as an officer. The soldiers altered weapons to shoot using water in a bully beef tin at a certain time without a man on the trigger to try and fool the Turks and not raise the alarm of the evacuation. The evacuation happened in December at night. The men left in small groups. They wrapped their boots to limit the noise they made and went to the beach for evacuation. The Allies continued their normal routines to not raise suspicion. Rifles and artillery were fired as normal. Equipment was taken at night, but the piers and the beaches were left with supplies to not raise the alarm. 20,000 men were evacuated successfully at first. More and more men were evacuated until half of the men were gone. By the end of December, the Allies successfully evacuated every man without a single casualty from Anzac Cove and Sula Bay. In January, the rest of Gallipoli was evacuated. The men had lived through hell, extreme heat and bitter cold, bad planning and poor leadership, shortages on supplies, and nearly every man succumbing to dysentery, illness, disease, and shortage of food, water, and supplies. The men who survived would never forget Gallipoli, and the Turks, who the Allies had thought would flee at the first sign of an invasion, had stayed and fought. They won. The Allies were gone. The Allies knew the Turks would fight man for man. They both feared and respected one another. In the end, the Allies did eventually make it to Constantinople at the end of the war. The casualties at Gallipoli were appalling. Here are the statistics from every country involved in the Gallipoli campaign. Newfoundland suffered 49 dead, 93 wounded. India suffered 1,358 dead, 3,421 wounded. New Zealand suffered 2,779 dead, 5,212 wounded. France suffered 10,000 dead, 17,000 wounded. Australia suffered 8,709 dead, 19,441 wounded. Great Britain and Ireland suffered 21,255 dead, 52,230 wounded. The Ottoman Empire suffered 86,692 dead, 164,617 wounded. Thank you for watching, folks. I hope I did Gallipoli a little bit of justice. I'm not a professional, but hopefully I did alright. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.